Hello and a very warm welcome to another edition of Talking Germany, the show where we do just that. And joining us here in the studio today is one of Germany's leading authors of literature for children and young adults, and he is Klaus Kordon. Thank you very, very much for joining us today. It's a great pleasure. Now, I should hasten to add that Klaus Kordon's appeal certainly isn't restricted to children. I, for one, count myself among his fans. First question, why do you tell stories?
I'm a storyteller. That's something I think you're born with. I noticed quite early on that my favorite things were to read and make up stories. But I didn't think about writing. That came later. I thought that people like me, storytellers, just wanted to put their 2 cents in. It could be a love poem or a poem about spring, because that's what they were feeling at the time. Or maybe they wanted to say something political. What's important is that they wanted to talk about what moves them and tell stories about interesting people or interesting times.
In English, it's very interesting because you have the word story, people tell stories, and then you have the word history. And these two aspects of those two words, they're very important, that connection for you, aren't they?
I think history plays a role in every story, and vice versa. When I hear about ancient Rome, there are so many stories you can tell about what happened there. When I tell a story, what I'm mainly doing is telling stories about the people who lived at a certain time, although in fact I've dreamt them up. They don't really exist. I put them in some era or another and accompany them on their path. I experience their little joys and greatest tragedies. All the stories have a historical setting. Children sometimes say that history is boring. In school, they get only dates and facts, when a war began or ended, that sort of thing. But if they knew how people lived then, if that was just mentioned in class, if someone would tell them how children of their own age, 13, 14, 15-year-olds lived, then they would really find history interesting.
Klaus Kordon, you tried to escape from East Germany, you were imprisoned, you were forced to leave the country eventually that was the country of your birth. Would you say you've had a hard life?
A hard life? Well, of course, it was hard when I was in prison. The children were taken away from us, and my wife was put in prison too. Yes, those were hard times. I spent 5 months in solitary confinement. The first week, I wasn't allowed to read a book or a newspaper, and couldn't speak with anyone or see a lawyer. And that's an important point, that I didn't have a lawyer. Of course, I asked to see one. Like anyone accused of a crime, I wanted a lawyer. We were told it wasn't allowed, and that we'd been watching too many American films. We could only see a lawyer after we'd confessed. But I refused. So they put me in solitary confinement and denied me books and newspapers and visitors. Those were hard times, especially when I thought about my children.
You are a victim of the former East Germany. Is that a fair comment?
You could say that. There are perpetrators and victims, if you want to use those terms, and I belong to the victims. Because if you're in prison and you can't see your children for almost 2 years, and your wife is in jail too, and all because you wanted to exercise your basic right to leave the country you live in because you just couldn't stand the fact that you were living in an unjust land, then you can't call it anything else. You're a victim.
If you are a victim, and that's what you've said, how angry are you today?
Well, I don't have any desire for revenge. It's not like that. Of course, I know it was an injustice. I was wronged. The children were wronged. In that situation, you experience, rage is too strong a word, maybe disgusted or insulted fits. When I think about what happened to my children, then I do feel rage, but that's natural. But I don't feel hate. I always say, hate makes you ugly, and that's pointless. People need to try to see the times as they were and to distinguish between victim and perpetrator, and to try to figure out what the perpetrators are doing now. Have they managed to disappear into the shadows, or have they been, in quotation marks, punished?
Oder haben sie auch eine kleine Strafe erfahren? In Anführungszeichen Strafe.
OK, let's pick up right where Klaus is talking about here. In recent weeks and months, there's been a fiercely fought debate here in Germany about the rights and wrongs of members of the Stasi, the former East Germany secret police, working in the civil service. There's really only one question here, and that is it time now to forgive and forget?
We should never forget. You should never forget history. You should always remember what happened and learn from it if you can. Forgive? That depends. I mean, no two crimes are alike. You need to look closely, and then if you get the impression someone is really guilty of a crime, then you can't simply forgive him. He has to be punished. But if he was very young, 19 or 20, dumb or naive, if you like, and didn't commit any real crime, then you can forgive him and say he gets a second chance. That's how I see it. You need to consider exactly what people did and didn't do.
An interesting question for you as a victim of the former East Germany, even if you say you have no feelings necessarily of revenge. Was the former East Germany all bad?
Of course, no country is all bad. Even people living in unjust countries have good times. The question is really whether East Germany was an unjust country or not. There's currently a lot of debate about this in Germany, and I say yes, East Germany was unjust. Of course, justice was done when they sent a small-time crook to jail. But when a man was shot on the border just because he wanted to leave, which is a human right, then that's not justice. When people are locked away just for publishing a text that they weren't supposed to, or because they said something that the government didn't like, then that's unjust too. Anyone living in a country where something's rotten will still have some positive experiences. I like to compare it to when old people tell me that not everything was bad under Hitler. I hear things like, back then when I was in the League of German Girls and they were good times. It nauseates me when I hear that, because I know what was going on back then, the concentration camps, the mass murder of the Jews and so on. Because people were young then, they just want to look back on the good times. But that's not really the whole story. What they should say is, back then I had some good times, but the system I lived in was wrong.
In 1953, there was an uprising against the former East German state. Construction workers were annoyed about the amount of work they were being asked to do, and it led to many deaths. There was a confrontation with the Soviet authorities as well. You were an eyewitness. What did you see there?
I was 10 years old and had to stay after school because I didn't do my homework. My friend picked me up afterwards and said a war is happening on Alexanderplatz. I didn't believe it. So we went there and saw it wasn't a war, but a riot. The workers wanted lower quotas. The quotas had just been raised, and they had to do more work for the same pay. But they were also calling for free elections and a unified Germany. They were workers taking to the streets to protest. We went along with them until they reached Potsdamer Platz, and then the shooting started. Russian tanks appeared on the square and shots were fired. But interestingly enough, from what I saw, it wasn't the Russians who did the shooting. The East German police opened fire on their own countrymen. We were scared and hid in a ruined building, and then a Russian officer grabbed us by the scruff of the neck and sent us home. That was one of those times when you get really scared, especially because they declared a state of emergency, which means that any meeting of more than 3 people becomes illegal assembly. My mother had to close the bar she ran at 9 o'clock, and the streets were dead. I was really frightened. I thought there'd be another war.
Three-dimensional history from Klaus Kordon. We've been talking about history and how people come to terms with its ironies, indeed with its cruelty. We see all those images there of Berlin devastated at the end of the war. That was the environment you grew up in. That was your playground. Did it seem like an extraordinary city to you, or did it seem just normal? You were a child. That's all you knew.
We didn't know the city any other way. When we really got to know it, the war was already over. I was only a year and a half old then. The city was as it was. And that meant in ruins. It was our playground. We built caves in the rubble, played cowboys and Indians, ran around in gangs. It was a fascinating playground for kids, but we knew it wasn't normal. You never forgot the war. Some kids didn't have fathers because they'd been killed in the war. Other fathers came back as cripples. You'd see them in the streets on their crutches. We were always aware that it isn't normal, but we accepted it because it was all we knew. It might sound strange, but we kind of enjoyed the freedom. Our mothers had to work during the day, so we were left to our own devices. After school, we got up to all kinds of mischief. The city was our playground, as people say nowadays. We knew something about it wasn't right, but we accepted it as it was.
You mentioned there that your father had fallen in the war. That was such a typical, fate for so many people of your generation. How did you cope with that? How did you deal with that?
That's very difficult to say. I only saw my father once when I was a baby. He had leave and came back from the front. I was told he held me in his arms, but I don't remember it. I never really had many photos of my father, just two, I think. I remember a dream I had as a child, a strange dream. My father was not a deserter, I know that. He was killed in action. But in my dream, 3 soldiers were shot for deserting, and one of them was my father. I remember that dream and waking up with a start, almost like I'd been shot myself. That was a nightmare from my childhood that I'll never forget. But in fact, my stepfather was a bigger problem. I could never get along with him.
The former American president, John F. Kennedy, when he came to Berlin, famously said, "I am a Berliner." What does it mean? What's the definition of a Berliner?
Of course, Kennedy wanted to make a commitment to freedom, and to West Berlin's freedom in particular, didn't he? But for me, Ich bin ein Berliner means something else. I was born and raised in Berlin. I spent 15 years away from the city, which is when I realized that I really was a Berliner. I missed my hometown. For someone of my generation to be a Berliner means to try to understand what our parents and grandparents did, to come to terms with it, and try and be different. The conflict came to a head in Berlin, East Berlin, West Berlin. It was a focal point of German history, and right from the start you had the feeling you should take responsibility for German history, maybe even more so in Berlin than in the Black Forest or on the North Sea coast.
Well, one Berlin institution has been celebrating its 100th anniversary. It's what they call here a Kneipe, traditionally a dark, old-style Berlin bar, often serving food. It's the kind of place where locals meet and share their opinions about the world. And the Kneipe in question, the Henne or the Hen, is famous for just that. It's chicken. Well, it might be a cult pub, but I've never been there. My question, Klaus Kordon, is that the real Berlin?
I think it's a mixture of what Berlin once was and what it is today. It does seem a bit touristy, even to me. It's not really the authentic Berlin bar that people imagine. It used to be, but it's changed over the years. You didn't used to be able to get a chicken in a Berlin pub, but it's still a nice reminder of the past.
You once said, you know a thing or two about Berlin bars, that's for sure. You once said that you lost your own mother to the bar on the corner. You've mentioned her already. Just tell us a little bit more there.
Well, I always say the bar consumed my mother. She was alone after the war with 3 kids to raise and a bar to run. That meant she had to get up at 6 in the morning so she could open at 8 and then work till 1 in the morning. I remember coming home from the movies and having to fight my way through the clouds of smoke she had to breathe in all day. She died when she was 50. And when I think about her life, her corroded life, it doesn't surprise me. Her father died in the First World War. Her first husband died from a disease, and her second was killed in the Second World War. Fate dealt her all these blows, and in the end, I believe it was just too much for her.
I've got the impression that in the bar that you're talking about, you as a youngster, you learned to observe other people and to tell their stories.
Of course, I helped her when I could. I poured beer or cleaned the glasses or got a keg from the cellar. It gave me the chance to observe the clientele. And after the war, there were lots of interesting punters. Our regulars ranged from rubble clearers to prostitutes, and from businessmen to dustmen. They had their own opinions. They argued with each other, drank with each other, danced, and sometimes even scrapped. You could really study the locals there, and it was there that I learned that everyone has a story.
Talking of stories, what's your favourite children's story? I've got to ask you.
Huckleberry Finn.
Huckleberry Finn. Yeah. Great choice. OK. I'd like to invite you to visit the Talking Germany website, where you'll find my blog on today's encounter with Klaus Kordon and my impressions of many of my other guests. Do have a look.
If you like Talking Germany, you can find out more on the internet. Our host Peter Craven is keeping a blog on the many shows and guests of the series. Find out more about what happens behind the scenes, gossip, experiences, and how the whole show is put together. Just visit blogs.dw-world.de/Talking Germany, and you can tell us what you think about the program there too.
And we're going to draw to a close, Klaus Kordon, this time with our traditional Talking Germany quiz. Quick questions, relatively quick answers. I've got some very philosophical questions for you this time. First up, story or history?
The story is the most important part. When I write a historical novel, the history has to be correct as well, but the plot has to be there first. I want to create lives, people, complete stories, ratcheting up the tension and so on. That's really important.
Fascinating. Fantasy or fact?
I've always been one for facts. I like to write the occasional fairy tale, but fairy tales are always somehow connected to reality. But I don't really care much for modern fantasy literature.
OK, let's speed up. Education or entertainment?
Both. That's the only way.
Berlin, a city of the past or a city of the future?
Again, both. The history is there, the past, and of course the future I hope the city will have.
The question of questions. Can we really learn from history?
Of course. We have to, and we can.
A very positive note to finish up with. Thank you very much for joining us today on Talking Germany. We've been speaking to Klaus Kordon, a man who makes history into stories. Fascinating stuff. If you've enjoyed his company as much as I have, come back next week.